Good evening from Chicago, and thank you all for joining this special program. My name is Denise Jorgens, and I'm the Director of International House of Chicago. It's an honor to welcome all of you to this Diplomatic Encounter Series program held in conjunction with the U Chicago Center in Delhi and International House. The series aims to provide a venue to hear from leading diplomats, engage them in open dialogue, and provide and to come to a better understanding of the issues, challenges, and opportunities facing countries around the world. Programs are held throughout the year and include the annual consular reception hosted by the Office of the President, which we held just this past week. Next year, International House of Chicago will celebrate an important milestone, our 90th anniversary. From the day International House opened its doors in 1932, our mission has been to promote cross-cultural understanding, mutual respect, and friendship among students and scholars, and on the part of the people of metropolitan Chicago, towards individuals of all nations and backgrounds. Through the International House Student Life Experience and our internationally focused public programs, International House is dedicated to transforming people's lives for a better world. This mission is further extended through the work of International House's worldwide organization, currently a network of 20 houses on 4 continents. I want to thank the U Chicago Center in Delhi for allowing us to partner with them on a series of programs over many years. Partnerships between organizations such as the U Chicago Center in Delhi and International Houses worldwide are critical in supporting the engaging, interesting, vibrant community and programs that we enjoy on our campus and around the world. I hope to see many of you at future events, both on campus in Chicago and at the U Chicago Center in Delhi. Thank you for joining us. And now I would like to introduce Professor Paul Staniland, Associate Professor of Political Science and the Faculty Chair of the Committee on International Relations at the University of Chicago. Paul?
Great. Thank you so much, Denise. It's a pleasure to be with all of you this evening or this morning or somewhere in between, depending where you are. So we're very lucky today to be joined by Ambassador Shambhu Kumaran from the Indian Foreign Service, which he joined in 1995. He's currently the Ambassador of India to the Philippines, Republic of Palau, and Federated States of Micronesia. His diplomatic assignments abroad have included postings in Frankfurt and Berlin, as political counselor in Kathmandu, and as Deputy High Commissioner to South Africa. So a very interesting set of quite different countries. At headquarters, he was Deputy Secretary in the West Europe Division, handling relations with the United Kingdom, Germany, and Spain, as well as the Commonwealth. And then he was Officer on Special Duty for Press Relations in the External Publicity Division. From 2012 to 2016, he was Director for East Asia and China, Joint Secretary Establishment, and then Joint Secretary Eurasia in the Ministry of External Affairs. From January 2016 until May 2019, he was on deputation to the Ministry of Defense as Joint Secretary in Planning and International Cooperation. That's a period I have some specific questions about when we get to Q&A. And then from June 2019 to July 2020, a very kind of the latter part of that being a very busy time, I suspect, he was Ambassador of India to the Kingdom of Morocco before now becoming Ambassador to the Philippines. He holds a bachelor's in English literature from Kerala, as well as an MA in international studies and MPhil in diplomatic studies from JNU in New Delhi. So Ambassador Kumaran is going to give a few remarks, kind of whatever he'd like to talk about. And then I have some questions that we'll go back and forth on. And then if you in the audience have questions, please put them, I think it's in the Q&A box would be the right place to put those. And I'll keep an eye on that list as we go. Okay, now it's our pleasure to hear from Ambassador Kumaran. All yours.
Thank you very much, Professor Staniland. And let me begin by thanking the University of Chicago for providing this opportunity to have a discussion on Indian foreign policy in the current context. Let me preface my comments by saying that since my current professional brief is related to the relations that I handle directly, most of my comments are in a personal analytical capacity. And with that disclaimer out of the way, I'd also like to particularly thank my dear friend Lenny Chaudhary of the University of Chicago International Center in Delhi and all her colleagues for helping to organize this one. Chicago, to most Indians, always rings a bell because most of us grew up studying about Swami Vivekananda's famous speech in Chicago, which to my mind is possibly also one of the first and finest cases of Indian cultural diplomacy in trying to interpret India's civilization to a non-Indian audience. So Chicago, and I think the university has continued that great tradition of engagement with India and South Asia. So it's particularly happy for a moment for me to be joining this event. I am assuming that most of those who are with us now, or those who would eventually join us, because most of these seminars have become a bit like video on demand. People who come back and visit it, and which I think is great. So I'd assume that most of those who are watching would have a fairly good understanding of foreign policy and an active interest in it. So I'm not going to get into a regular sort of context in terms of geography and try and interpret something immediately. So I mean, it's fair to say that for most countries, and India is no exception, that foreign policy is essentially about two major objectives. One, economic development, and two, national security, and how countries engage in a variety of formats and a variety of structures to try and achieve their developmental needs and national security requirements. And it's also very clear that we live in a time when fundamental shifts are underway and countries are having to reevaluate their positioning and their approaches. And the rapidity of that change, both in terms of relations between geographies, in terms of technological changes and the way in which the world is ordered, obviously has a serious impact on India. So what I try to do is to perhaps outline what I think are four main sort of strategic pillars that I see as being at the heart of India's foreign policy strategy in the current period and looking ahead. And these four for me are: one, India's growing role as a key global economy and a technology partner or player, if you will. Two, India's role as a leading power in its effort to try and project and promote its national security requirements primarily. Three, I would think that India's personality as a civilizational state. I think this is not something that's been talked about a lot, but I do believe that this is going to be fundamentally important, especially for those in the West to understand India's new foreign policy priorities. And lastly, I think the pillar of India being a responsible global actor and India being part of the solution to the world's problems, to the global issues that confront us today. Particularly, I would say, sustainability and climate change and various other issues. So really, these four pillars, I would say, the economic pillar, sort of national security pillar, the civilizational state, and our role in global structures. Let me try and get into that in some detail one by one. When we talk about India as an emerging economic and technological player, it's very clear that we are a very large market, and obviously that in itself is of great interest. And India is also very private sector driven as an economy. And the effort of the government in particular over the past few decades has been to rationalize the role of the state and make it a more empowering and regulatory role rather than a direct market actor. So the private sector has begun to play a very important and even more important role in the way in which India conducts its economic relations. Over 3 decades, especially since we opened up the economy in the early 90s, the effort has been to enhance foreign direct investment and liberalize our trade structures so as to integrate ourselves more fully with global value chains, while at the same time, like most countries do, to try and maintain critical domestic capabilities, especially to meet our developmental objectives, because we are always conscious of the fact that we do have a very large chunk of our population that is in need of support and assistance and developmental outlays, if you will. I think that the post-COVID or the COVID and post-COVID period have sort of posed a lot of questions to this broader approach. There's obviously the realization of excessive dependence on some sources. And there is now also a greater felt need to work with trusted partners and to ensure the reliability of supply chains. And we want to do this even while maintaining the overall framework, which we've been trying for the past 3 odd decades, to enhance India's global engagement. One of the other fundamental priorities has been the need to encourage domestic manufacturing. And this is where I think the impact has been felt directly in terms of our trading arrangements. And we had hit the pause button on the RCEP, which was a very large trading arrangement. We decided not to progress further with that. But at the same time, we would have seen of late that India has moved very quickly and aggressively to close FTAs with the UAE and Australia. And we have very active discussions underway with the EU, the UK, as well as Canada. So somewhere there is perhaps a need to correct the perception that India is kind of pulling back from trade. I think the idea is that we are seeking a framework of genuine mutuality in trade, not in terms of creating an artificial balance of trade, but in terms of ensuring that there is mutual benefit for both parties and not one-sided benefit. And here, I think it's important to elucidate that the approach that the Prime Minister has outlined of Atmanirbhar Bharat, or self-reliant India, we see this fully in synergy with the broader approach that I outlined. A more capable India, we believe, would be, especially one that manufactures more, will also be importing more and integrated more with the global value chains, and also be able to meet and provide more requirements for the world. So Atmanirbhar Bharat is a contribution to the engagement with the globe. And a more capable India, we believe, will be of great value, as we saw during the COVID crisis, where we were able to supply medicines, medical supplies to over 150 countries. And of course, our vaccine manufacturing capacity as well. So I would say that Atmanirbhar Bharat is a forward-looking, dynamic way of carrying forward our international economic engagement. A second key element, other than trade in terms of the economic element, is that of connectivity. And connectivity, of course, is something that we've been aware that we have a long way to cover. So we've been stressing on the connectivity with our immediate neighborhood, but also we've been working on projects in other geographies, in our extended neighborhood. And here, one of the new interesting elements that has come up is our partnership with like-minded countries, Japan, the United States, to provide, or even the European Union of late, we've had very good discussions on this point, to how to try and bring our capabilities together to provide viable and sustainable models for connectivity projects. we also link that to a very massive infrastructure push that is underway in India in terms of transportation across the board, roads, rail, ports, airports. And this we feel complements the outreach abroad, with foreign companies being involved in the process in India and Indian companies working abroad in similar projects. So this is my fundamental first point with regard to the economy, that this is a broader foreign policy approach from India, that a stronger India is in the interest of building a stronger global economy, a more resilient and sustainable global economy. And here, talking about sustainability, the green economy, here again, you see Prime Minister himself personally driving the agenda, setting ambitious targets, working towards a net zero goal. And you see here again, we are engaging more internationally than we did in the past. So even as we do more at home, we do more abroad. Look at the concept of the International Solar Alliance, the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, and a variety of other projects that have come up where India is playing an active role. I think the idea is really the critical role that we can play to solving global issues. Another point here, which has come up and will remain very salient, is that of the digital economy, where we're talking about standards, processes, and social imperatives like data sovereignty, developmental aspects, individual privacy. It's a whole set of issues. Indian IT has already established itself as the service provider of choice for the world. And in terms of the new emerging sectors like data analytics and the knowledge-driven economy, will remain a very significant player. So even as we look for more scale, I think India already is also working on the skills for this new economy. And given our experience of frugal innovation, we feel that India's digital economy and our startups can provide a lot of answers across the tech space, agri-tech, edu-tech, health tech, fintech, and it's already happening. We've already just seen the 100th Indian unicorn. And I do believe that here again, we are very much, as we build our domestic sector, we're very much networked and linked with our partners. So that's the economic box. It took a little longer to explain it because it's a very large and varied box. The second is that of India as a leading power, and this relates primarily to national security, as I mentioned. And here I'd just like to touch on a couple of points. Defense, particularly, in a basic way, I think the objective is to have a strong degree of capability, domestic capability, particularly in defense, maritime security, and in emerging new domains such as cyber and space. Here again, domestic capability means partnerships. And India is perhaps unique among large countries in having not just one, but two proximate adversaries with whom we have a complicated geography and a complex history. And obviously that dictates a certain amount of defense preparedness. We do see that this focus on domestic and defense industrial capacity, stronger research and development, and better equipped armed forces as an imperative of our foreign policy engagement. And some of it will happen with India's own resources, but we really need a big chunk of partnerships. And this is again an area of mutual benefit. And we have had a variety of partners to help work this. Beyond defense, of course, we are looking at ensuring a more stable region, attending to non-security threats such as radical terrorism, refugee flows, pandemics, natural disasters, other man-made crises. And if you look at India's record over the past few decades, we've been really the first responder to various countries in our immediate neighborhood and extended neighborhood in terms of HADR. And this ability to act when needed, obviously, is something that we would like to maintain, whether it be in terms of HADR or even sometimes to scotch cross-border terrorism. We'll have a forward approach to counter imminent threats. or reprisals for attacks in a real early time frame. Politically, what does the leading power mean? It means that we would want to play a greater role in global affairs. We've already been elected this last year to the UNSC as a non-permanent member, and we've been actively engaged in all the issues on the agenda. We have a set of plurilateral mechanisms ranging from the Shanghai Cooperation Organization to the Quad. And of course, been very, as I said, very front and center in responding to global issues such as climate change. So this, to my mind, is the second box, the second pillar of India's foreign policy engagement. Let me come to the third one, and this is India's role as a civilizational state. To me, this is not a mere statement of historical fact that there has been a continuous evolution of society and state in India over a period of thousands of years. But it is essentially a manifestation of a systemic thought process whose threads are becoming very, very visible in recent years. First, I think let's look at it in terms of democracy. And I think while the West does stake a large claim on how modern democracy has evolved, all the way from the Greek civilization through Enlightenment and modern constitutionalism, I think it is, for India, our democracy is linked partly to that same legacy. But there are some key elements, some critical elements in my view, that predate the Western linkages. And I feel personally that this has created the fertile ground on which democracy has flourished in India, as it has in relatively fewer other post-colonial societies. Let's take the basic model of the panchayat, where you do have a deliberative mechanism that deliberates on local issues. And to my mind, is a symbol of the inherent democratic way of social organization in India. Obviously, we can quibble about the details and the exclusions, etc. But I think what's critical here is that there is a fundamental thought process that still thrives in India about consulting and deliberating before deciding. And to put it in context, there's a concept of Janhit, for example, the people's welfare. And this is kind of like a test for all decisions by the leadership. It's the benefit of the larger community. Does this decision benefit the larger community? And this is any body that decides. Even monarchies had to go through that test in some form or the other. And sometimes this is expanded to Sarvajana Hitaya, Sarvajana Sukhaya, which is, something that is in the larger interest of the greater number and the welfare of the largest number, all of society. And this is again, if you look back at Prime Minister's campaign in 2014, that campaign slogan of Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas reflects this inherent Indian democratic concept of consulting the people and making sure that decisions meet the test of popular welfare. And actually, this gets extended further. When you're talking about democracy within a society, you cannot talk about purely in terms of welfare of the immediate society. So in the Indian context, civilizationally, we do talk about Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, which essentially means that the world is a family. And we see this, the entire planet is linked, our futures is interwoven, and therefore peace and prosperity really are indivisible. We need to work together to make sure that everybody progresses. Another extension of this whole civilizational thought process I would submit for your consideration is the approach that we have civilizationally to ecological issues in nature. Now we see Prakriti or Mother Nature as being something that we not just worship, but something that we need to give back to as much as we take. And this notion of ecological dependence and an innate sense of harmony with nature really is at the root of a lot of the approaches that we have proposed to cope with the climate and sustainability. And this goes even to the extent, like in the Jain teachings, when you talk about non-violence, even to the smallest sentient beings. So it's really a civilizational construct whether it be in terms of democracy, in terms of global affairs, or in terms of climate change and ecology. There's really a deep civilizational connect that Indian foreign policy is now drawing upon. In terms of actual manifestations, you'd see perhaps it is in terms of the effort to introduce yoga to a wider audience, Ayurveda, the whole concept of well-being. And here I think it's very, very clear that there is a rediscovery and going beyond the exotic image of Indian civilization that was there in the 60s and 70s in the West, and a deeper understanding of what India as a civilizational state represents. So this, I think, is the third pillar, which is very, very important, especially for our friends in the West to understand, because when we say that we understand democracy, I think there's a deeper, more layered and more historical context in which we say that. India is a responsible global actor, and this is my fourth and last pillar. And I think we could see that India has always played a role in international affairs, especially over the past 75 years of our independent existence. And I've also spoken about how we've been able to assist other countries in our neighborhood. And here, I think the responsibility is primarily a manifestation of our understanding that countries, especially larger ones, have to meet the test. I'll give you one example. A similar time that the Philippines was having this arbitration in the South China Sea, India and Bangladesh had an arbitration on our maritime boundary. The outcome was not exactly in favor of India. It was to the greater advantage of Bangladesh as a smaller country. But we were very clear, very committed to accepting the outcome, whatever that be. I think this, in terms of technology, are immaculate non-proliferation credentials. Despite being at the denial end of the technology control regimes, we were always conscious of our global role in not contributing to problems, but being part of the solution. And even when we responded to threats, which we have had to occasionally, especially in the recent past, we've made sure that it is proportional and that we have kept it as minimal as possible while being effective. We have also provided an enormous scale, despite having our own developmental requirements, enormous amount of developmental assistance to other developing countries. In terms of capacity building and training, the Indian ITech program run by the Ministry of External Affairs, for instance, already since 1964 reached nearly 120,000 government officials and professionals from different developing countries. So we've been sharing and nurturing capacities across the world. And obviously our approach to norm setting in international bodies has been constructive. We've advocated the interests of the global South, we'll continue to do so. And for instance, on the COVID crisis, our entire response, if you see from being a healthcare provider to setting some of the new norms, has been animated by the need to be a constructive actor, often at the time of even having greater priorities of our own, trying to somehow match those with our international commitments or our international role. One other manifestation of that perhaps could be in terms of the role in UN peacekeeping. So I think today I was trying to give you, from my perspective, some really critical pillars that sort of anchor India's broader foreign policy approach. And I deliberately do not want to get into, because I know that Paul will come into some of the questions on the topical issues, but I think the framework in which we are approaching Indian foreign policy, moving from a policy to a strategy as the topic was suggesting. And I think these are the key pillars that I think we need to keep in mind. Thank you very much, and available for the discussion.
Great. Great. Thank you so much, Ambassador. That was a very nice kind of encapsulation of some really important strands that I think have been articulated very clearly in recent years. So I want to start with a different kind of question, more about yourself, which is, how did you decide to become a diplomat? And what has surprised you about kind of doing diplomacy as a professional?
Well, I started with literature as my graduation subject. And at some point of time, after 3 years of literature, I figured that it was kind of a little offbeat for my liking, and wanted to get into something more alive and contemporary, if you will. Although literature continues to be of interest, but international relations and the whole notion of being part of the process of engagement with foreign countries. So I shifted streams, joined my master's in international studies, and then joined for a PhD in diplomatic studies, at which time I appeared for the civil services examination, which, as you know, is the route for Indian diplomats to enter the diplomatic profession. So it was, in a sense, a desire to kind of be more in the moment and be responding and be part of a vital sort of process that was underway. I suspect also that as India was opening up in the early 90s, there was a greater interest in how India would. We were moving away from a defensive approach of non-alignment where we were being acted upon. We saw ourselves as being acted upon more than being an actor. And this, in the 90s, I think there was a new spirit that India could. And now we've seen that manifested very actively. So all of these things led me to that. What surprised me most is that that while things appear to move fast, there is a degree of slowness in diplomacy. And I think it is good that it is so. It is good that diplomacy is contemplative. Oftentimes, a lot of the problems are because we're not contemplative enough. So it was surprising, but I understand why it is so.
That makes sense. And that leads me to another question, which is kind of, again, before we get into kind of broader discussions of Indian strategy, what is daily life as an ambassador like, whether in Morocco or the Philippines? What do you find yourself occupied doing? Is it slow? Is it fast? Is it responding to email? Is it going to very important meetings? Is it getting calls about nationals who have ended up in a sticky situation? Kind of give us a sense of what it actually is.
The tempo varies considerably. You can have periods of which are like a lull, and then you can have periods of very, very intense activity in terms of tempo. So, but let me put it to you this way. The way I see it, we do have two primary sort of focus areas. One is to protect our interests, because there are some core interests that may be affected in some form or the other, and those are non-negotiable. But there's also a promotional role, and some relationships have more of a protective element as opposed to a promotional element. Some may have both. But I've been fortunate both in the Philippines and in Morocco, where my mandate was to go out and engage and expand the envelope of interaction. So the key thing is, they say a good diplomat is one who's rarely found in office. So you have to go out there, meet people, and try and identify the opportunities for engagement. And quite often, you're not doing the actual activity. You're just putting the right people in touch with each other. But increasingly, I find that we do need to constantly follow up and monitor. So there's a body of work that you generate, but implementation and outcomes are very, very important, because you do have people meeting, talking, saying, yes, we can do this, and then trying to find the vehicles. Sometimes it may be funding, sometimes it may be finding the right fit of institutions to do something together. And daily life is not, unfortunately, a lot about, they say foreign policy is 10% alcohol and 90% protocol, something of that sort. But really, I think it's a very serious profession, sometimes dull. The format for engagement is very helpful when you have these larger events. We get to meet a set of different actors. And obviously, in terms of relationships, I'm fortunate to be dealing with positive and constructive relationships, as I said, where we promote rather than protect, if you will.
Thanks. So moving into kind of what you work on a regular basis, can you give us a sense of how India approaches both the Philippines specifically and also kind of Southeast Asia? As some of you in the audience probably know, India has been pursuing kind of an Act East policy, which is a successor to the Look East policy of the 1990s. What does that mean? What are areas of opportunities? What are challenges that you've run into kind of trying to advance that agenda in the broader region and in the Philippines specifically?
So that's a very large question. But let me just say that with the Philippines, we have worked closely on the economic agenda, which means we've been talking about trying to revive our trade. Of course, India did well last year. We crossed $2 billion of exports to the Philippines last year. We've been focusing on areas where there is mutuality of capability and requirements. For example, agriculture. The Philippines is very interested in reviving its agriculture. India's got enormous experience, and structures are similar. They've got small farmers, low utilization of technology, etc. So finance, fintech, as I was mentioning earlier, we do have very strong engagement on health. So one of the things that we worked very hard during COVID was to try and see if we could get vaccines across, getting through that process. India is the largest supplier of pharmaceuticals to the Philippines. And so if you see across that space, and Indian companies in the BPO sector are very, very active in the Philippines. And, I would say that the BPO sector is obviously one of the leading sectors in the Philippines, employing over 1 million people. And Indian companies themselves employ close to between 150 and 200,000 Filipinos in their operations. So it's a very, very large and varied relationship. We've also added an element of defense and security cooperation. That's also developing well in the larger construct of the Indo-Pacific. And that brings me to the idea of how we are engaging with ASEAN. So while we have this bilateral engagement, which we're trying to expand the envelope and deepen, there is also the ASEAN framework where we see Philippines is playing a more active role to support India's engagement with ASEAN. We have the 30th anniversary of our engagement with ASEAN coming up. So really in ASEAN, again, there's a focus on connectivity, on economic issues, and obviously on political dialogue to try and understand each other's priorities, because in this framework of the Indo-Pacific, India's engagement with Quad and our overall approach to the region under the Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative and ASEAN's own approach to the Indo-Pacific. I think the idea is to have more dialogue, explain our views, understand what the Philippines is trying to say. And we've had a visit by my minister, Dr. Jaishankar, in February. The Philippines Foreign Secretary has been to India last month. So very, very strong and emerging dynamics with ASEAN, with the Philippines. And in the broader construct of the Indo-Pacific, really to look at where some misperceptions sought to be generated about that engagement also. Oftentimes we need to try and correct those. So this is typically what I would describe as a generic answer to a very large question that you posed.
Which, you mentioned at the end misperceptions. Which misperceptions would you say kind of are most prevalent or that you find yourself dealing with?
Well, I would say that the idea that somehow there is a choice between, sort of like great power competition, and countries are called upon to make a choice to go this way or that.
Mm-hmm.
The idea of how we are engaging both bilaterally and in the framework of other mechanisms, in particular Quad, to try and highlight the commonality in the agenda and the approaches. And we found that obviously the Philippines has had a very positive and constructive approach to these issues. In some other countries, there have been doubts and concerns expressed. But overall, I think as we engage and as we have more dialogue, we find that the very constructive agenda that we have is something that the ASEAN countries value greatly.
So this leads to a question, kind of, you mentioned great power competition, the Indo-Pacific, we could talk about dynamics like the Quad. So as China grows more powerful, one of its tools of influence, of course, is economic investment. I mean, massive flows in the last 20 years in particular. In your presentation, you mentioned that India's economy is largely private sector driven. So as a government actor, kind of how do you don't have the same kind of massive state-owned enterprises that at least parts of the Chinese economy have, that kind of, at least in some cases, the government can direct. How do you navigate that as a government actor, trying to kind of direct Indian private sector flows into particular markets or particular sectors? How does that work?
An excellent question. And that really is the heart of the matter. So what we see in the Philippines, for example, is that there's an Indian private company that has constructed and operates the second largest airport. They've just built another airport terminal. Obviously, the private sector on its own is not able to always generate the investments or the finances required for large infrastructure projects. So this is where we look at concessional funding, and we've offered a line of concessional funding to the Philippines for infrastructure and other projects. So the idea is that we also work with partners such as the United States or Japan or the European Union to see where we could work constructively together to ensure that whatever we're doing doesn't go into the same trap of financial dependency and ecologically and otherwise unsound decision making. We feel that therefore the private sector participation is very essential because projects also have to meet the test of commercial viability. So we would continue to focus on encouraging private and, where possible, of course, public sector companies to come in with support of the, so under the Indian concessional funding, for example, it's not that we have a process whereby we encourage only the Indian public sector to come out. We actually encourage a very competitive tendering process so that the right company at the right price can offer the project. So what we've been doing from the embassy is over the past 2 years that we've had a lot of seminars and conferences, bringing in the key actors from both sides to try and explain what's happening in India. We did one on infrastructure, we did one on the blue economy, we did one on renewable energy. We've done a range of events where the businesses from both sides. These are B2B events with a layer of governmental support. And we found that there's an enormous lack of information and awareness. So we're trying to bridge that gap. And secondly, encourage Indian companies to come into the Philippines. And we are beginning to see that. There are already, as I said, some companies here. We're beginning to see a degree of interest. And hopefully it can be sustained. And I think it's very positive what the framework that we're looking at to sustain that engagement.
Now, just kind of very briefly on this, were you doing something similar in Morocco, or was Morocco kind of I just don't know what the scale of economic flows are, but I imagine. So,
yeah, you see, the thing is that because the relationship with Morocco was also very, very similar in that there was a lot of untapped potential. So some of the things that I had started there was a series of events with regional economic chambers. And to just get Indian companies who had already invested, whether it be in automobiles or, there's one of the Indian companies does PET recycling. There's a variety of Indian companies there. But the idea was that those companies weren't able to really engage with the wider section. So we tried to bring in key decision makers from the Moroccan economic space to engage with them, get them across to India to see what was happening. Really, India's economic diplomacy is beginning to kind of gain traction, and private sector investment abroad is a very important element of that. And that was something that was very strong in Morocco. It's very strong in the Philippines. It's strong worldwide. And I believe that beyond that, if we can encourage a degree of positive trading arrangements, I touched upon that in my presentation, to understand a mutually beneficial trading arrangement. If we could do that, that could really help. And lastly, there are a large number of Indian professionals everywhere. And one of the efforts that I've tried to do is to encourage them to act more, as bridges than they are currently. So to actively, shall we say, project India's capabilities, try and bridge the gaps in information, act as, partners. So this, I think, is also very promising in the Philippines context, because there are a lot of very, very skilled expats working for MNCs or who've been based here doing a lot of trade. So all of these efforts are coming together.
So I'd like to kind of stay within the first pillar for this next question, and then maybe pivot to some of the security kind of pillar number 2. But you'd mentioned kind of India's approach to trade at kind of a high level of mutuality. And I was wondering, for the sake of our audience who may not kind of know some of the specifics, what would you say are the main sectors or issues around which kind of India is attempting to shift the kind of the global trade regime or dynamics around intellectual property? Kind of 2 or 3 key areas where you think India has a different position than, say, the United States, and kind of why might that be?
Well, I think the commonalities with the United States are larger than the divergences, really. And I think there is somehow maybe a need to understand India's trade approach better. I don't think that India, as I mentioned, India is not moving away from trade. We want more trade. Just this year, we actually crossed $400 billion of exports for the first time. The issue here is, when trade arrangements start impacting very negatively on your manufacturing capacity, and as you know, India has a problem in terms of raising the level of our manufacturing. And for various reasons, we were out of the global value chains for very long. And it's only in the last few years that we've begun to actively try and be part of those value chains. So what we would really like to see, for example, with the United States, is to see greater investment into India by US companies, leveraging the manufacturing capacities that India can generate, and thereby, sort of making it a mutually beneficial process. There are obviously areas where the US would like to see greater market opening. And I think this is being discussed between the two countries. Some of the concerns regarding IPR, etc., I think belong in the past. We very much managed to address those effectively. And in fact, the largest market for Indian generic pharma is the United States. And the largest number of FDA plants, approved plants outside of the US is in India. And I think there is recognition in the United States that this capacity is something that is in our respective interest, but also in the larger global interest, like we saw during COVID. So India, that meets the requirements of 1.3 billion people on its own, let's look at food grains, for example, is something that is in the interest of everybody. Because if India was in the flip position of having to look for it abroad, we would then have a net negative impact on global security and stability. So I think this perspective is beginning to be understood. And we see that beginning a positive dynamic of engagement.
So let's move to the security realm, which you kind of articulate as the second key pillar. And that's one where sometimes it can be harder to find mutual benefit in some circumstances. And so I'm curious, obviously, this is a large and complicated issue, but the rise of China is not simply an economic matter. It's also one that has kind of broader political and military influence in Southeast Asia, where you're currently working, in South Asia, where India is located, where you've worked in places like Nepal. So one of the responses that the United States and India and Japan and Australia have kind of worked together on is known as the Quad. And I think this is an area that Americans are kind of learning more about, but sometimes it's not clear what is the Quad, and maybe a better question is what isn't the Quad. And so from your perspective, especially being located in the Indo-Pacific, could you give a sense of kind of how India views the Quad, both what it is, what it isn't, and what it might be?
Well, I think we've had the first Quad summit already, and we're going into the next Quad summit. So it's really an engagement and a framework that all countries are prioritizing, all member countries of Quad. And the engagement is quite intense in terms of trying to obviously understand each other's perspectives. I think that's something that is of value to the Quad members themselves. And then, of course, in terms of crafting a response. I think, obviously, there is a predilection to try to look at it in a primarily security framework. But I think what Quad has tried to do is to outline some of the other activities that it wants to focus upon. And this includes climate change, it includes resilient supply chains, critical technologies, and somehow through those activities, generate the habits of cooperation among ourselves to work together to, and also meet the requirements of this region in the Indo-Pacific. And really a cross-cutting set of responses across domains. And we believe that as like-minded democracies, we do have a degree of trust and confidence in each other and in our ability to work together. So this is the framework that I think is important to project.
Okay. Thank you. I want to move to a different part of the globe. And so India has occupied, I think, a different place than some other American partners or like-minded states when it comes to the Russia-Ukraine conflict. And obviously, the Prime Minister was just in Europe and the Foreign Minister has spoken on a number of occasions. But I was wondering for our audience, if you could give a sense of kind of an Indian or Indian government sense of, or take on, I should say, the conflict, kind of like where it came from, how it's best resolved, right? I think that would be very interesting.
Let me take off with, and as you rightly said, this has been articulated very, very exhaustively. And the Prime Minister has just been on a visit to Europe where he met, I think, 7 or 8 heads of state and government. And obviously, this is very, very topical in Europe, and this matter was discussed. So our primary approach to this is that we must have a cessation of hostilities and violence. I think that's the fundamental point that we've been trying to drive at, and that there is a need for diplomacy to be given a chance. That essentially we have to go back, in a sense, to the basic ways of dealing with crises of this nature. Pacific settlement approaches to kind of try and bring this back to a process where we're looking at a settlement outcome. So that's what we've been doing. We've also been, of course, initial stages, we had a lot of students stuck in the region. We were able to evacuate each of them. We also had, we have been and will continue to, I think, provide humanitarian assistance to the extent that we can. And we've all obviously been, the Prime Minister has spoken to the leaders of both countries, I think, and I said, as you know, we've had these discussions in various formats, and our approach has been very clearly articulated by the Minister in Parliament, Prime Minister during his engagement. So there's really nothing much more for me to add there, but to say that, obviously India has approached this as it will from an Indian perspective. And I think somehow some of our friends in the West not able to fully appreciate that. And I think it's possibly a US spokesperson who said that India should decide on which side of history we should be. And I thought that was somewhat ironic because we were celebrating the 50th anniversary of Bangladesh. So, somewhere I think it's important to accept that there are perspectives and that those perspectives can be different, and to work with that. And we are willing to kind of engage very constructively, remain there.
Well, that's what these kinds of events are useful for, is to get different perspectives out there. One thing I just want to say to the audience, that I see one question already in the chat. If there are other questions, just to type them into the Q&A, And I'll ask the ambassador a little bit later in the event. So please feel free. There's one already in there, but others should go for it. So let's talk about the region now. Kind of, we've gone to Asia, we've gone to Russia and Ukraine. I'm following what's happening in Sri Lanka very closely these days. Nepal's had some very interesting stuff recently. Pakistan obviously now has a new prime minister after a fairly dramatic several days. Can you give us a sense of how India approaches its neighborhood, especially in recent years? There have been ups and downs in relations with all of these neighboring states over the last decades. How does India think about its place within the subcontinent in general? Areas of strength, areas of concern?
Yeah, I would urge that we look at India's relations with the subcontinent beyond the news cycle, because oftentimes if you get caught in the news cycle, you tend to think that the relations are going in a particular direction. Broadly speaking, I would say that, and having served in the subcontinent and in Nepal, I would say that obviously in a neighborhood, there are a lot of issues that keep coming up, which need a high level attention. But broadly speaking, India is far more effectively linked economically to our neighbors than we've been in the past. And that is increasing. That's why I mentioned this focus on connectivity in my presentation. And that's something that we've been very, very consciously promoting, both as a way of ensuring that the infrastructure requirements of our neighbors are met, but also in a sense to try and repair some of the networks that have been disrupted due to various developments in the subcontinent that don't need to be explained. So we do have a large degree of interaction between the private companies, and they are very, very actively involved in our neighborhood. We have managed to successfully address various issues with regard to terrorism and radicalization and various other non-security challenges in this region. It's obviously an ongoing, it's work in progress on many of these elements, river waters, environmental concerns. These are actively in need of management. But what I will also say is this, that I think that we have had a very, very, shall we say, supportive approach to the developmental needs of our partners in response to them being a little more aware and conscious of India's security requirements. So that's that degree of mutuality that is at the heart of this relationship, these relationships, many of them. So we've been willing to work more actively to meet the developmental requirements of our smaller neighbors, be more generous in our openness to them as a market, and as a provider of investment, as a capacity building partner, doing small development projects at government grants. So you see this broader approach, and in response, a stronger, more robust political dialogue from the highest level down to the official level to address some of the management issues. It could be transnational crime, insurgent groups, various other issues, non-traditional security issues, terrorism, for example. So obviously, this with the larger neighborhood. With Pakistan, of course, the set of issues is very, very complex. Not possible to get into it in great detail here. But really, the key there, I think, is that India has a very constructive approach, and we'd like to see a neighborhood that is peaceful and enabling for both our rise as an economy and the rise of our respective smaller neighbors.
I was wondering, kind of on a more micro level, you were in Kathmandu from 2007 to 2009. So for those in the audience, this is a period, Nepal has just had a civil war involving a Maoist insurgency, which you don't see that many of these days. 2006, there's a peace deal, demobilization, and kind of a period of, in some ways, rebuilding the political system. And so, Ambassador, I was hoping you could just give us a sense, what does it mean to be a political counselor in Kathmandu during this period of kind of very dramatic change in Nepal's politics?
Yeah, we played a very active role in bringing the peace process to fruition in Nepal, in providing our good offices. And obviously, as Nepal moved towards institutionalizing the gains of the democratic movement, the Jan Andolan, etc., that happened, we played a supportive role. Our approach there was that, please tell us what you would like us to do. We definitely did not want to be prescriptive, because at a time of great change, it is important that we don't add another layer of complexity of what we wanted. So Nepal and the Nepali people and the Nepalese parties and political formations engaged very intensely with each other. We were, I would say, supportive of that engagement, and essentially, we, very clearly, I did mention the point about contemplation in diplomacy and being a little slow. So perhaps, in a massive change of the nature that happened there, perhaps some elements of that change did not necessarily lead to positive outcomes. But I think in general, the people of Nepal were as sovereign decision makers in that regard. And I think India's role was to assist wherever possible and be, shall we say, focused on the need to continue to look at things that would bring more stability to that country, which had been through a fairly long period of political instability, insurgency, and violence. So I think it is fair to say that today we do see that those levels of violence are down. The developmental processes have returned. You could argue whether it is complete or not, and I suspect a lot of people would say it's not complete. And, that's a fair argument, but the conditions today do permit greater opportunities for Nepal to realize its potential, be it in hydropower, maybe in tourism, generally as to develop its economy. And I think what happened during those transition years, the fact that it played out the way it did, perhaps to my mind were a good example, with the caveat that I said that some elements perhaps would have required a little more thought. I think overall, it provided a framework for Nepal to return to the path of stability and growth.
Just one thing kind of that comes out of your remarks, I just kind of, in the United States, I think we often look at India through the lens of kind of great power politics, the rise of China, the rise of India, Europe, Russia. But a lot of the pillars you've discussed today are really centrally linked to India's neighbors, especially kind of Bangladesh, Nepal, Sri Lanka. Obviously, Pakistan's kind of a different, as we say, kettle of fish. But it's interesting how several of these strands kind of are woven through these relationships, especially things like connectivity. You also had a role kind of working within India's Ministry of Defense. And so that is an interesting thing for a diplomat to be working within. And I was wondering if you could tell us a bit about what you did there. What were the tasks, the goals, the things that you were pursuing? I believe this overlapped with a set of foundational agreements with the United States. So just at a general level, first give us a sense of what you were doing, and then we can kind of talk a little bit more about what that experience was like.
So my role in the Ministry of Defense had two verticals. One was a vertical of planning, and the second was that of international cooperation. And in terms of planning, essentially, it was about the civilian perspective on trying to, sort of expand, diversify, deepen the sort of military structures, capabilities, etc. So I mentioned the issue of new domains, for instance. We are obviously going through a process of integration of our defense services. We have created a new post of Chief of Defense Staff. So some of those thoughts were under process at that time. So that was the planning mandate. It was quite a demanding one, but by nature very slow and involved a lot of deliberation and consultation. The other role, which was very, very dynamic and very extensive, was that of international cooperation. So what we do have, of course, in all defense ministries, is that the military has its own mill-to-mill engagement. But somewhere in terms of the larger context, the defense ministries, kind of provide the umbrella mechanisms for those. So you have joint committees, joint mechanisms, meetings of those groups. And I was quite fortunate to be able to handle that role at a time when India's defense diplomacy really emerged. I mean, Prime Minister opened up the whole concept of defense exports. So we started engaging more beyond the military to military capacity building. We also started looking at how India could help capability augmentation of our partners. And that is now beginning to come to fruition. We are beginning to see a more and more use of Indian defense equipment. And the other element was to obviously try and sensitize various defense ministries about the Indian approach to issues, for them to tell us how they solve some of the issues of their interest. So a dialogue between the defense ministries. And one of the big things was to try and bring together various elements. Like we do a lot of military training for our partner countries. We do send out some training teams abroad. We do a lot of exercises. We would consult on the kind of engagement that we would have at the service to service level. So one of the things that we came up with during my time was the tri-services exercise with the United States, which we did for the first time. So broadly, and as you touched upon, we did sign some major agreements, and I was happy to be leading the negotiations for those. The two foundational agreements that we closed, Lemoa and Comcasa with the United States, but we did a logistics agreement with France. We were able to really, I think, it was a very rich and varied set of requirements. Obviously, we also had ministerial engagement, the defense ministers' visits, and both. I remember 2017, if I recall correctly, we had possibly 20 or 21 defense ministers who visited India that year. And my division had to sustain that. So it's essentially looking at about 2 defense minister visits a month. And, those were really, really intense days. But India was wanting to engage, and a lot of countries also were keen to engage with us. So that was the job.
What's it like being a diplomat working within a Ministry of Defense? Does it operate according to different logics, different hierarchies, different kinds of just modes of working, or was it fairly seamless?
So the idea of having a diplomat there, I think at a fairly mid to senior level, was to try and have greater connectivity with our embassies, to understand the MEA's perspective on our diplomatic relationships, without having to go through a constant process of consulting with the ministries, so to have a very smooth coordination, if you will, between our diplomatic engagement and our defense diplomatic engagement. So for that, I think a diplomat was well suited, and I was happy to be appointed there. I worked there for nearly 3.5 years. I'd like to add that oftentimes people tend to assume that diplomats only do diplomacy all the time. With some, but we in India, we do have a bureaucratic role as well. So we do find a lot of Indian diplomats when they are in Delhi, being sent to other ministries, whether it's commerce, sometimes in finance, work in the Prime Minister's office, on National Security Council issues. So we do have a variety of other, sort of postings that our diplomatic service requires us to do.
Can we talk more specifically about the foundational agreements with the United States? Kind of what were the main issues that needed to be worked through there? For people who may not be as familiar.
We had these agreements under discussion for quite some time. I would say that they were nearly for about 2 decades. They were under discussion. As India and the United States discovered the potential for defense engagement among us, we signed, I think, a general security of military information agreement sometime in the early 2000s. And thereafter, these agreements, obviously, there were some who in India felt that these agreements would shall we say, impact on our autonomy and our ability to take independent defense policy decisions. And obviously, when we looked at those agreements later, we found that they were enabling agreements, and I felt that there was obviously a degree of political support to do those agreements. It wasn't an official level decision. It was a high political decision that we would proceed with those. But nevertheless, it required to be negotiated down to the details in the text, and again brought back to the political leadership for decision making. So it was a slow and laborious process, but we were able to close it in a realistic time frame of a few years rather than keeping it pending. And I will say that these agreements have really, shall we say, helped propel our partnership with the United States, which I personally feel that the defense engagement with the United States is a very critical element of India's national security, and will continue to be so in the near future and well into the future, I would say. So therefore, these agreements were something, steps that we thought could cement and deepen that engagement. And also from the US side, oftentimes there was a feeling that the absence of these agreements reflected a degree of, weakness in our commitment to the relationship. So from that perspective also, it was very useful for us to put that behind us. They are enabling agreements that help us to cooperate, and they help to build a climate of greater trust and confidence in each other.
So just on the America front, there's a question in the chat asking about Indian engagement with Latin America, South America specifically. And I wanted to piggyback on top of this a question about kind of the reach of the Indian Foreign Service, basically kind of give us a sense how big it is. Where is the IFS? Are there particular regions that receive greater priority than others? How does India manage relations with countries that are perfectly friendly, but maybe not major trade partners or diplomatic partners? So this is kind of what does India do about the fact that it's a very large world and resources are always limited in any institution? So whether it's South America or some functional areas, kind of where does India put its focus and how does it deal with kind of managing the rest?
Yeah, so one simple way of looking at it is to look at it as a set of concentric circles, with the neighborhood obviously being a great priority. And that's where most of our, as I said, immediate issues and the day-to-day issues, developmental issues, security issues have to be addressed. But beyond that, I think there's a lot of focus on our extended neighborhood. If you look at it from the east, from the ASEAN down to the Indian Ocean region, to the Gulf, and even into Central Asia and the larger Eurasian space. Definitely a much bigger focus nowadays. A very, very critical priority continues to be all the major economic players in terms of, let's say, the G7, also the permanent members Security Council. We've had very strong ties, as you know, with Russia. So in this context, obviously, relations that are, let's say, with Africa or Latin America have not got historically the attention that they deserve. But that is changing quite rapidly because you do find a lot more Indian engagement in Africa. And historically, this is one of the best periods for our engagement with Latin America. And we are now beginning to see greater opportunities there, in terms of our economic engagement in particular. There's a large set of, just an illustrative example with the Ukraine crisis, with oil seeds becoming a problem in India, as you know, is a large importer of edible oil. And Argentina steps in with the ability to supply soybean oil. And so broadly, the recognition that that we haven't explored Latin America, and Latin America on its own beginning to understand the economic opportunities in India. And a similar situation in Africa, although we've been politically more present in Africa, and our economic engagement with Africa has grown. Capacity building engagement has been very strong. And we also having a nascent security engagement with Africa. Definitely the focus on these regions has increased, and I suspect they will continue to increase. In terms of the foreign service, your question's interesting. What we did have a period when, for internal bureaucratic reasons, there was a decision to trim the bureaucracy and to bring it down. Obviously, that did not figure in the growth of the economy and the need for the state to play a role. It doesn't play a direct role. Obviously, it has to play a regulatory role and a supportive role and a promotional role. And so we've corrected that little dip in numbers. The numbers have gone up over the past decade or so. Overall, we do have over 1,000 directly appointed diplomats, but also we do have diplomats who are part of the staffing structure who get, trained in the ministry itself to handle diplomatic roles. So I would say our numbers are in the high 2000s overall. And obviously, it would help to have more. And that discussion is underway within the government. A lot of our embassies have local staff to support our work. So it's not purely India-based. So our embassy sizes are much larger than the size of the Indian Foreign Service or its affiliated pool. So really, we would like to have more. Our mandate is growing. The expectations of various interlocutors is growing. And I think at political level, there is attention to that. We will see more and more of that happening.
I think that leads into what I think will be my final question for the evening. It's getting late here, and I'm sure you have many things to do. What are areas that you think are kind of as yet untapped opportunities for India, whether it's regional, you've just mentioned Africa, or substantive areas, whether it's economic or climate? What are areas where if you had kind of resources and time and you were put in charge, what are 2 or 3 areas that you would really focus on that you think kind of have yet to receive as much attention as they could?
Well, the priority will continue to be economics. I mean, trade, investment, technology partnerships, because as I said, the priority is to generate the momentum in the Indian developmental trajectory. So using and leveraging our international relationships to elevate India into a developed economy, that's the primary motivation. So more trade, more investment, more integration into value chains, but at the same time, recognizing that there are political considerations that impact on these decisions, as we now see in the larger global context. Economic decisions have political consequences, and obviously those need to be kept in mind as we go forward. So the concept of resilience in terms of sustainability, the concept of trust in terms of who is a reliable partner. So reliance, resilience, these factors in our economic engagement also come in. The other key element would be in terms of developing our national security capabilities. I mentioned that issue about defense capacity in the broadest possible sense, defense industrial capacity, partnerships with the world, but also in terms of continuing the focus on counterterrorism, maritime security, newer domains such as cyber, space. And what we've also been mandated is to look at tourism as a key enabler of economic growth. So trade, tourism, technology, the 3 T's have been prioritized. And so you have a cross-section, a cross-cutting of geographical priorities because where we are located, and functional priorities because of what we want to achieve. So it's really a very, very wide palette. And obviously the limitations are not purely in terms of resources, but also in terms of what other countries are willing to do. And we do find that in many cases, we would like to do a lot more. And that effort to try and sort of elevate India's trajectory. And also, as I mentioned in my presentation, we do find that our civilizational ethos has something to contribute to global well-being. And for many years, we've sort of had a somewhat, shall we say, slow approach to promoting it. But really, I do believe that going ahead, we will continue to promote India's innate approaches, whether it be on democracy, on well-being, health, in terms of trying to jointly solve global issues. I think that there is an Indian personality in foreign policy, and that that we have a view. We are 1/6 of humanity, and obviously it's quite natural that we will continue to play. We will begin to play a growing role. And I mentioned what Prime Minister's done with solar energy, for example. We do a massive program in India, develop capacities, but also project it abroad to the International Solar Alliance, create a platform for countries to work with each other. So that really is the template on which we will continue to work.
Well, it seems like you have a lot of work cut out for you in the years to come, so it will keep you very busy. I'm now going to ask Lenny Chaudhary to just say a couple of final words here, and I want to thank you, Ambassador, for taking the time with us today.
Thank you so much, Paul. Well, I was just thinking that lot of food for thought, and it's expected when thinkers, strategists, advocates brainstorm on issues like this. And very happy to also share that as a forward-looking university, we are tempted to think globally and in global interest. So discussions like this further solidify our mission. So for making this possible, I would like to first of all thank Ambassador Kumaran for taking time out and so lucidly covering such a wide spectrum from personal anecdotes and personal journey to and linking it up to the larger international relations spectrum. So thank you very much for that. Professor Paul Staneland, I don't know how to thank you for always facilitating such great academically and practically rich dialogues and discussions. Thank you so much, Paul. Dr. Denise for introducing us to this idea, and all the participants and my colleagues from the iHouse and the center in Delhi. Thank you very much for making this possible. And I'm sure this is the first of the many rich diplomatic encounter series that all of us will witness. I hope all of you continue to join us for the subsequent dialogues. Thank you all, and have a great day or an evening ahead. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Namaste.
Yeah.